right, sorry to the delay here. We've had some technical difficulties, unfortunately, but I want to welcome all of you here to our Monday forum, and everyone online. Thanks for being here. This is the kickoff for our fall Campolo Fellows Lecture Series and Missions Forum, and we're thrilled to have our guest here for a few days, the Reverend Dr. Michael Battle. It was a pleasure and honor for me last night to pick Dr. Battle up from the airport and have some time to connect and chat about his experience and history with Tony. And so I got some more of the personal biographical information, and know that he heard Tony speak at Duke Divinity Chapel back in the 80s, and eventually came up and spent some time serving in one of the ministries with Tony and EAPE here in Philadelphia. And while he was at Princeton Theological Seminary, Tony served as his field education supervisor. So they have a great history together. And it just makes this time for Tony and for Dr. Battle and for all of us a little bit more special because of that history and connection. So just a few quick announcements before I do the formal introduction. As a reminder, for anyone who has class at 11, we will break at 10:50 to dismiss you, so that's not disruptive to Dr. Battle and any questions and answers that are taking place at that time. So we will linger after for anyone who'd like to stay. Following the forum, we are going to have lunch together across the hall in the Baird Library. So if you're staying for that, you don't have a meal plan, we are happy to provide, cover your lunch, which will be through the cafeteria and taken into the Baird Library. This is the first of multiple events this week. So we have a forum this morning, the luncheon. Dr. Battle will be in a series of classes this afternoon, and then some things tomorrow and tomorrow evening. The next public event is Wednesday morning at our chapel, which is in the McGinnis Auditorium on the other side of campus. So we invite you to join us for the chapel and the luncheon that will follow that as well. So delighted and happy that you're here, and looking forward to this together. The Reverend Dr. Michael Battle is the Herbert Thompson Professor of Church and Society and the Director of the Desmond Tutu Center at General Theological Seminary in New York City. Dr. Battle earned his undergraduate degree from Duke University, his Master's of Divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary, a Master's of Sacred Theology from Yale University, and his PhD in Theology and Ethics, also from Duke University. He was ordained a priest by Archbishop Desmond Tutu in 1993, and Desmond Tutu also officiated your wedding and the baptism of your 3 kids, so you obviously have a close and beloved friendship with Desmond Tutu. And he's written 11 books, including his most recent one, which is the Desmond Tutu, a spiritual biography of South Africa's confessor. And it's been an education for me diving into this book. But he also co-authored with Tony while he was at Richmond Theological Seminary. Virginia Theological Seminary, thank you. The Church Enslaved, A Spirituality of Racial Reconciliation. It's an important book that he co-authored with Tony about an important topic, particularly in the American church, but also in the South African church. So in addition to all the writing, Dr. Battle is an academic and a priest, and so he's served as the vicar of St. Titus Episcopal Church in Durham, North Carolina, the rector at Church of Our Savior in San Gabriel, California, rector of St. Ambrose Episcopal Church in Raleigh, North Carolina, and served in a number of other churches in North Carolina and in Cape Town, South Africa. In his Peace Battle Institute, he works on subjects of diversity, spirituality, prayer, race, and reconciliation. He served as the chaplain to the Archbishop Tutu and Congressman John Lewis in the House of Bishops. And in 2008, was the chaplain to the Lambeth Conference of Anglican Bishops. So he's a busy man. And so we're very grateful that he's taken some time to be with us this week. So thank you, Michael, for your time and your presence. And we are looking forward to learning from you and listening to you, being in conversation with you. Thank you all for being here in person and online. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bauer. Welcome.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you all out there in the cyber world, and thank you all who are here physically present. That's no small feat, is it, to be physically present? So we give thanks for both worlds. I want to, and thank you, Robert. Thank you for inviting me to this. It's like coming home. This place, and Tony has been kind of a major shepherd through my own rites of passage. So this is an honor to be back here. What I want to do is to talk to you autobiographically, and I want to talk to you theologically. So I want to start out with that sort of autobiography so that you have a grounding and a context for this theology I'm going to lay on you, okay? And I want to start out with two pithy stories from my life with Tony, and then how they relate to my growing up and my formation before we get into the theology of Ubuntu and Atonement theology. So the two pithy stories. One is passionate, you know, the way that Tony is passionate, and the humor of him always spitting on people in terms of how passionate he is. And the other one is humorous, and that's also a great gift that Tony has. So the passionate story. He tells the story about being in a village in Haiti. Most of you have probably heard this. If not, you should have. And he's on the border, and he's about to take the plane back into the capital city in Haiti. And as he's getting on the helicopter, a woman comes up to him with a baby in her hands, saying, "Take my baby, take my baby." And Tony, knowing that he can't just take her baby, there's so many other babies he would have to take. And he couldn't do that legally anyway, to take her baby, gets on the plane. And as this plane takes off, he could even still hear the passion of this woman saying, "Take my baby, take my baby." And as Tony flies away and she becomes like an ant, and then slowly she disappears, the great judgment of Matthew 25 comes to Tony's mind. In as much as you've done it unto the least of these, you've done it unto me. And he comes to this realization that he was leaving the baby Jesus. Now, Tony tells that story much more passionately than I just did. But the power of that story shows you the kind of teaching that Tony gave the world, and it is giving the world, that you cannot separate your passion from what Jesus is teaching us about. In as much as we do anything to the least of these, we do this to Jesus. And so the humor story. The humor story is that he tells a story about one of his students. So be careful with Tony. If you say anything to him, it might be repeated. And the student says to Tony, "I thought about becoming a minister, but Doc, you have no idea how much sin is in my life." So the language of calling Tony Doc gives me the kind of Sherlock Holmes deduction there's probably a Black guy who's telling this story. So he says to Tony, "You know, I thought about being a minister, but Doc, you have no idea how much sin there is in my life. I am so unworthy. I just can't do this ministry because of my unworthiness. And Tony said to the student, you know what? I sent another student over to be with Archbishop Tutu. And guess what? That student said the same thing to Archbishop Tutu. I'm not worthy to become a minister or a missionary. And Archbishop Tutu said this, don't worry, because the way that God works is that God has very low standards. And then Tutu continued, do you understand what I just said? God has low standards. So don't say I'm unworthy, I'm unworthy, I'm unworthy. Come just as you are, and Jesus will transform you. But you've got to be committed. You've got to say to Jesus, here's my life. Let it be made holy, yielded, and committed. Those two kind of pithy stories are important for what I call an Ubuntu worldview. And I'll get into Ubuntu as we go. But I want to still stay with some autobiography. When I was in first grade in Raleigh, North Carolina, it was 1970. So I'll let you do the math in your head about how old I am. I was bused an hour each way. And like a fish doesn't know it's wet, a first grader doesn't really understand the world. And I was bused an hour each way, and I did my homework on the bus as I went through my formative years as a student. And to this very day, my best thoughts come when I'm traveling. And as I was going to school at Sherwood Bates Elementary School, I realized that something was afoot as I was growing up in a white world. And in 1982, Sherwood Bates closed. And as I look back when I was in high school about Sherwood Bates closing, I felt like I had something to do with the closing, that my Black body contributed to the entropy, the slow decline of Sherwood Bates Elementary School, that my Black body contributed to the lower value of the housing around Sherwood Bates, that my Black body as a student that was integrating this school contributed to the lower value of that school itself. I began to think that being a child, a 7-year-old, was contaminating the value of the place and the people. I knew something was wrong, even though a fish doesn't know it's wet. And Sherwood Bates became Josephus Daniels Middle School in order to hold on to the school and to keep it alive. And something happened that was cataclysmic. During the COVID pandemic, an incident happened in North Carolina's history which had long been misrepresented, and it's called the Wilmington Massacre. And during COVID, the News and Observer, the newspaper founded by Josephus Daniels, was brought out, was revealed, was shown to be the instigator of the Wilmington Massacre. This newspaper, founded by Josephus Daniels, reported how the founder of the News and Observer was the instigator of the November 10th, 1898 Wilmington Massacre. Originally, the Wilmington Massacre was reported as a Black riot, but the News and Observer excavated the actual event and reported that Josephus Daniels incited a riot in which whites overthrew duly elected Black governmental leaders, organized white mobs, forced out elected officials at gunpoint, and burned and looted homes, property, and businesses of Black citizens as they attempted to build lives and communities after slavery. At least 60 Black people died that day, November 10th, 1898. Here is where a fish does not know it's wet. The massacre was the result of white terrorists incited to action by Josephus Daniels. And as I said, the owner of the News and Observer, but also the name of the school that took over my precious elementary school. If you know about Josephus Daniels, you will understand it. If you want to look it up in the News and Observer in 2019 issue, that what he did was his name took over in a way in which it was a victor's history as long as you did not know what was truly going on. And no students could receive publicly funded money in 2019 once the name was revealed for what that name truly represented, the glorification of white supremacy. I tell you that story because it's important to think about when we are trying to understand Ubuntu. Ubuntu is an African worldview that names reality much differently than we do in the Western world. In our Western world, we name reality based on solipsism. It's a fancy word, philosophical word, which means to be an individual. And one of the greatest articulators of this comes from the European Enlightenment, René Descartes. René Descartes has a famous proverb of, I think, therefore I am. It's a worldview in which true reality is given to an individual agency of consciousness. And what really matters is the naming of an individual who sees the world. Unfortunately, René Descartes did not anticipate the consequences and the outcomes of the European Enlightenment's worldview of solipsism. We today in the Western world are wet with this European Enlightenment worldview. As long as you don't really know what is truly occurring in community, everything is okay. As long as a fish doesn't know it's wet and you can get away with as much as you can, everything is okay. But for us who are not drinking the Kool-Aid of the European Enlightenment, there is another way of naming the world, of seeing the world, and especially as an African worldview, which has a different proverb than I think, therefore I am. The African proverb of Ubuntu is I am because we are, and because we are, I am. It uses this this language of the deity of I am, to explain relationality in terms of defining reality, not solipsism. Because you see, if you live in a solipsistic reality, reconciliation, forgiveness, love, it really is unintelligible if you are the only one who really exists. But for Ubuntu, we exist because someone else exists. And here's something that's really hard for us as Western people. We can only be saved if we're all saved. You can't be in heaven conscious that someone is in hell. How can you be completely happy, aware that someone is suffering, weeping, and gnashing their teeth and saying, "Take my baby, take my baby"? How could you still be existentially completely happy? How could you still be in heaven, conscious that someone is in hell? Ubuntu is a different worldview that's really strange for us who are wet with a European Enlightenment worldview. And the difficulty for us in our Western world is the same difficulty of me being bused 1 hour each way, unaware of how I am affecting the world, unaware of how my own self-esteem as a human being is being determined by alpha individuals who cover up history. When I was in 7th grade in 1975, I attended what is now called Carnage Middle School. You can see I have bad luck with the names of my schools. And I recall walking back to homeroom in 7th grade. And I recall walking back experiencing something that I will never forget. I remember walking, and all of a sudden, as I turned the corner in the hall, I was going to homeroom. I don't know if you all had homeroom going through school. And I encountered, actually, I was accosted by 2 of my classmates fighting like animals. And there was no language, only guttural sounds. It was existentially coming in contact with violence that I never thought could be capable in a human being. And as I encountered that violence, all of a sudden I had an epiphany. And the epiphany was whether I was going to be, keep in mind this was back in 1977, whether I was going to be Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House. I know this is non sequitur, right? Going from this violent fight to this epiphany that I was either going to be Tip O'Neill, become a politician, or whether I was going to be like sort of my ancestry. My great-grandfather was born in slavery, and he was a minister in Western North Carolina. And my grandfather also was a minister. He worked for the Hatfields and the Hatfield and McCoy feud. My ancestry was a line of Levi, of priests and ministers. This epiphany was whether I was going to continue in my succession of ministry to be a minister, or whether I was going to be Tip O'Neill, a politician. For some reason, I had this epiphany as I saw this fight on the way to homeroom. And the reasoning that I was in the midst of, the conundrum that I had was, if God is real, I would want to be with ministry and participate in healing the disease of what was before me, of human beings reverting to an animal nature. But if there is no God, then I think I will join politicians who can at least get at the symptoms of the disease. The conundrum, if God is real, I want to go into the ministry, unworthy as I was. But if there is no God, the best we can do is to pontificate in a political system that inevitably covers up the truth, but at least can try to steer us away from killing each other. As you can see now, today, I'm not Tip O'Neill. I never became the Speaker of the House. I'm wearing a collar, so you know how this all turned out. But it is a reality, a conundrum that was based on an encounter with human beings who were not human. And this leads me, lastly, to getting into some of this theological jargon of Ubuntu, as well as atonement theology. The reason why I think atonement theology, which is about how is it that God heals the disease, not just the symptoms, how God saves our existential reality once and for all, how the cross is the representative, the epiphany, looking upon this violence, how that creates an epiphany for how we are saved, but most of all, who we truly are. How that matters is in atonement theology, which Christians believe God saves us through the cross. And unfortunately, the European Enlightenment got a hold of this theology of the atonement, so that even to this day, we believe that our salvation given to us on the cross is personal salvation. We believe that what really matters coming from the cross is that Jesus has saved me. And an African worldview challenges that European outcome of personal salvation. Ubuntu is not only in the proverb, I am because we are, but Ubuntu is, I think, an African cultural concept, and surely social scientists will criticize me for being ethnocentric, anachronistic. But I think Ubuntu is also a theological worldview, because what Ubuntu articulates is a person is a person through other persons. A person is a person through other persons. And that's theological, right? That's the Trinity. The way we make sense of one God is the interdependence of persons. We don't believe God is an individual. That's a heresy. That's called modalism. We believe God is a person through the other persons of God. And it's called perichoresis. These persons are so interdependent that their dance of being persons makes them one person in three persons in one nature. And I think as we understand Ubuntu's worldview, we must apply that to atonement theology as well. We can't be satisfied in our salvation if others are not also satisfied in their salvation. The difficulty in what I'm saying, as I'm sure is hitting you, that this guy's a heretic up here. The difficulty of thinking this through is because a fish doesn't know it's wet. We've been given a European worldview of how God saves us. But salvation is through the interdependence of God's persons. The image of God is not as an individual. God is not a man upstairs, and we don't thank him once we score a touchdown and thank the man upstairs. God is the image of God. The imago Dei is community. The image of God is community. And inevitably, when I'm teaching this in a class, someone raises their hand. Of course, they're angry with me and they're saying, well, the individual matters. But think about this. If there was no community, you would not know you are unique. If there was no reference point, fish doesn't know it's wet. If there was no reference point of others, you would not know that you have a good sense of humor. If nobody's laughing, if no one exists to laugh at your jokes, there is no reference point for your uniqueness as an individual. There'd be no language. There'd be no theology. There'd be no God. If all that matters is an individual, the mystery of God is how God is interdependent. But in our Western world, we see this as codependence. If I have to depend on you to be me, we call that codependence. And it's because of our Westernized European Enlightenment worldview. I'm not trying to just poo-poo the European Enlightenment. It gave us some good things, such as the focus on human rights and how the individual matters. Even Jesus talks about that, the numbers of hair on your head. But what's important for us to underscore here in an Ubuntu theology is that left to our own devices, we easily can become mere animals who live based on the instinct that the only reality that matters is me. We can live based on the motivation to only think about what is in my best interest. And our worldview becomes what's in my best interest is always to overcome. And what is in my best interest is always a zero-sum game that I have to win, and that means you have to lose. An African worldview turns all that upside down. And Ubuntu is that worldview. That the only way we win is by recognizing that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Ubuntu is a worldview that helps us to see that unless we can depend on each other, no one can be saved. And Jesus's work on the cross is similar to Moses holding up a serpent so that the Israelites could be healed. Jesus is hung up like a snake wrapped around wood in order to see our own evil, to see the evil that often goes covered up. Jesus's great ministry, one of the things he did the most was to exorcise demons to give us eyes to see, ears to hear. And this is the beauty of Ubuntu. Ubuntu helps us to see what we are wet with, what we are calling Christianity that is not Christian, what we are doing and saying is incongruent, and how we oftentimes are focused merely on our self-interest. For example, there are 26,000 Christian denominations in the United States that declare taxes. Do you think Jesus set in motion the intention of having 26,000 Christian denominations that declare taxes? Or is that the result of solipsism? Is that a result of a capitalistic structure in which there is a zero-sum game of who is truly a Christian? I close with a way for us to make sense of Ubuntu and theology together. And I think it's using language that is more akin to contemplative spirituality. And I know the kind of trope of I'm spiritual but not religious. I know that that's actually a problem. And I also know that spirituality, if you Google the word or the words Christian spirituality, it's only like white people that populate that branding. I know and I realize that the focus on spirituality is problematic itself. But because theology has been so controlled by European discourse, I think spirituality, the focus on Christian spirituality at least opens up the door to a fish knowing its way. And the reason is because spirituality is about relationality. It's got the eponymous word spirit in it. And spirit is always about relationality. If you look in the New Testament, whenever the Holy Spirit is around, usually you've got diversity and unity occurring at the same time, simultaneously. If you look at Pauline theology, one body, many members. If you look at the second chapter of Acts, of course, this mystery of people speaking diverse languages, but they can still understand each other. When the Holy Spirit is around, there's this relationality, which lends itself more toward understanding Ubuntu. That relationality is really what matters in the life of God. I think Ubuntu lends itself to a Christian spirituality in which we get out of our heads only, because that seems to be the control of European discourse, linear rationality. And we also get out of our hearts. And what I mean by that is the passions that have been resulting from this European Enlightenment have been passions focused on the individual. Ubuntu helps us to get into another mindset and another heart set. Ubuntu helps us to understand that God is in my mind and heart at the same time. That they should not be separated. That what we think and what we feel should find confluence. And when we think and feel in a confluent way, we become like Tony's student, who understands that I cannot be worthy unless I see God's worthiness in the world, not just in me, but in each other. We cannot be saved unless we understand how my actions are resulting in your harm. and in how your harm is resulting in my harm. It seems to me that in public discourse today, Christianity has been hijacked so as to create a false narrative that as long as one group gets the biggest piece of the pie, we can all be saved. But that goes against what Jesus teaches, especially in what Jesus teaches in the great judgment of Matthew chapter 25. In as much as you've done it unto the least of these, you've done it unto me. So I'm going to close there and allow some time for questions, answers, sermons, pushback.
Yeah, thank you very much. So good. So the only thing I'd ask is that our students do have to leave for 11 o'clock, which is great. Thank you, guys. Good to see you. If you would repeat the question that's asked so that anyone online can hear, and we'll go from there. But I know there are going to be at least several questions. But see you. Yeah, ask. Go ahead, Dakota.
Was it something I said? Yeah.
I was just curious. So Christian spirituality is actually like a mandatory course at Eastern. So when you said that there was like a flaw in that like mindset, I was kind of curious what you meant by that, because as ministry students at Eastern, we actually have to take Christian spirituality as a course.
Yeah, I'm just trying to say to be mindful that there are flaws around the naming of spirituality, and spirituality is slowly being controlled through a commercial market of the dominant society, the white society, and also that Christian spirituality can also be used ineffectively as some kind of difference of being religious. And I think being religious is a good thing. So I applaud, just like I'm doing in the book I'm writing on this, I'm using spirituality and I think it's good, but we have to be mindful of the problems around it.
Yeah, so like when I hear you say that, it makes me think of the way in which white Western people have appropriate like yoga and all these other sort of spiritual practices, and all towards like self-actualization, right? Like that's the goal. It's like to become your best, highest self.
Right.
And there's a de-emphasis on being conformed to something with someone else.
Exactly right.
It's an individual. You go to yoga and you participate in whatever you get out of it. And I'm all for yoga. I mean,
Yeah.
stretching is great, but I mean, it's also takes on this sort of deeper spiritual thing that people feel like they're participating in. It's like it's all self-serve.
Yeah.
Or not all, but it's vulnerable to be.
Yeah, and the current ways in which we understand spirituality is that we are almost running away from the world. We are trying to find a balance and equilibrium away from this chaos of the world. And we're doing this so that we can be healed and our contemplation can make us peaceful, because that peace is different than the craziness out in the world. And it's a similar criticism of the monastic movement being apolitical, withdrawn. So it's a movement away from, in many cases, for the way that we understand spirituality, Christian spirituality, you're moving away from. And I don't think that's adequate for Jesus's discipleship. I think Jesus did move away from, but then he got right back in the battle. And I'm just afraid that our understanding of spirituality is just this incessant moving away from, not the ebb and flow.
Right. It's not incarnation.
Right. Yes,
I just want to challenge that a little bit as someone who practices yoga. In yoga, I think there's a lot that we can learn because yoga is practiced in community. It's practiced together. What happens in the space that you're doing yoga in, what somebody else is doing impacts you, impacts your own practice. And there's, at least in my studio, after each session, the instructor says, like, we're trusting that the energy movement that we did here today will send ripples into our community. That what you do isn't just for you, isn't just for self-actualization, but to empower the community more. I think that practices like yoga can teach Christian spirituality a lot.
So for those of you out in the cyber world, there was this pushback to say that yoga and sort of Eastern Christian spirituality, it doesn't have to be just about the individual. It can also help the community. Yes.
Yeah. So it's, you had mentioned hell, right? People go to hell, and what do people die every 2 seconds, right? So if you were truly, because I mean, it's just unconscionable to me, right? The conscience tormenting, where you'd be pleading almost every 2 seconds, like, please God have mercy, please God have mercy. Walking around, I mean, it's tormenting to the conscience, right? To even live that way, right? And so Jeremiah 31:33, you talk about our heart, our conscience, our inmost parts, right? We're right on their minds, right on their hearts, right? So we have that to wrestle with, right? And I think there's so much to be said for the Holy Spirit. And then at the same time, you mentioned Matthew 25, right? And there's verses where because it does say, right, the righteous go to eternal life, right? Wicked go to eternal fire, right? And then how do you kind of wrestle with verses like that, right? And it's totally based on works too, by the way. Right? It's not based on a relationship with Jesus. It's completely talking about works. So just that wrestling of where you would see that, where you would see God's judgment, also balancing unknowingness, right? I feel like that really original sin, right? From the tree of knowledge and good want to know, God's knowledge. So just really where you would, to me, I feel like humility and recognizing that we're not the judge and unknowingness is the best place to stand, right? Ultimately, being able to hold that.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if you feel the same way, or if somebody was just to ask you, what do you think hell is?
Yeah, so the question is the difficulties around this conundrum that I put in front of us. How could you be in heaven conscious of someone in hell? How could you still, practice a faith that we are with God? And I like your word, unknowing. How do we know, for example, that we are with God, and how will we know? Well, I think it's a false dichotomy to place heaven away from earth. In other words, I think Jesus is. I think heaven is God's presence. That's what I think heaven is. It doesn't need some hereafter. We can see who's in hell now. And so the implication is, how can we be happy here on earth, right, with our lives, when someone is saying, take my baby, take my baby. So I think heaven and earth have to be converged with understanding God's presence. And we believe as Christians, God has revealed God's presence through Jesus. And we believe Jesus has given us the paraclete of being present with us. And then Luke, out of all of the gospel writers, says that, heaven is already here with us. So I think the work is removing the scales from our eyes. The work is having eyes to see. The work is excavation of what's already here, and our best hearts and minds from the desert tradition of Christian spirituality. They were not trying to go somewhere in the future. They were trying to return. They're trying to return to God's presence, trying to return to the Garden of Eden. And so I think the work is not to have this mindset of dichotomy, but how is it that we can cooperate, participate in what God is already doing and participate in who God is already being. Does that make any sense? Yes.
So then, how do we do the work of helping God bring about the kingdom on earth? Is it through getting more people to believe that Jesus rose again to save us, or is it by bringing about justice for all people, or is that also a false dichotomy?
Yeah, I think if you can say what you just said without the I, to try to say your sentence without the I. Try to say all that you just said without the first person.
You want me to?
Yeah, try to do that.
How do we bring about the kingdom of God? Is it through getting more folks to believe that Jesus raised from the dead, or to save us all, or is it bringing about justice for all people?
And so in both equations, the we trying to do this is also the we that's the recipient of the need, right? And that's what I mean by confluence. We are also in need still of God's saving grace, but we also are called, even though we are unworthy, that's why I started out that story, even though we are unworthy, we're still called to be protagonists and proactive in helping the world do it. So it's the same broken people that are being used by God to save the world. We are helping our worldview, first of all, that we are broken, is halfway to salvation. But if we think just fighting in the hallway like animals is a norm, then that's hell. Because in other words, if we think we can just take advantage of people with our economic systems and medical care and being the greatest nation on the earth, if we are not seeing the interdependence of all of us, then we're making matters worse. If we have no consciousness of each other, we're making matters worse. The beauty of the Christian faith is that you do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's a beautiful confluence. And that takes work. I mean, it takes awareness. Hopefully some of you and those in the cyber world, I know you were mad at me in some ways when I was trying to get out of the personal salvation, but hopefully there was an epiphany that, I really can't know my uniqueness. And I'm extrapolating that. I really can't know I'm saved unless I understand that through the reference point of the community. Yes.
Hi, I took a note of something you said that says the control of European discourse is linear rationality. You went on to follow that, talking about how Ubuntu helps us understand God is in our hearts and our minds simultaneously.
Yeah.
So could you explain a little bit more what you meant by the control of European discourse is linear rationality?
Yeah. When I was in graduate school, I had to learn German and French, right? And I did not have to learn Zulu or Xhosa, and actually that's what I should have learned in my theological work. And so a European worldview has just totally controlled theological discourse, especially German theology, which is called Teutonic, and it places a lot of either ors on you. And this linear way of understanding salvation. But Now, to be fair, German theologians have changed and are changing, but we still are in a westernized worldview that expects almost a calculation for how to be saved. It's almost a mathematical example of what salvation looks like. As long as you solve the mathematical equation, you will understand it rationally. And in universities, we critique each other based on if someone solved the mathematical equation correctly. And unfortunately, also in divinity schools and universities, we have kind of low self-esteem because we're trying to prove to the law school, medical school, that we matter in the university. And so we try to be more rational than a law school, just to kind of prove that we are worth being there. Instead of understanding the power of the relationality of religion, the power that religion is in most of our conflicts today, instead of trying to get at those really necessary issues that a university can help in terms of a divinity school. Does that answer the question? Do you have any pushback or anything on that?
No pushback. I think my only follow-up on that would be how would you combat, or in your opinion, how would you move forward with less calculation? What would you present that would best help us toward a more relational, spirit-driven communication with one another in divinity, but also just in
Yeah, good. I think education can't be separated from formation. And that's another thing that theological discourse can provide to a university. So I think we need prayer alongside studying Bart, and even Bart will admit we need a newspaper alongside, studying Bart. We need each other, warts and all. And we need to exercise some demons about who's an inferior thinker based on a white dominated European discourse that's called theology. And we need to also, among the prophets among us, to give some credit to that rigorous linear way of understanding, but to say that's not the end all. So we need each other. And oftentimes theology and spirituality is pitted against each other in a zero-sum game. And we need to figure out how is it that we can cooperate and expose students to as much as we can in theological discourse, but also experience as much as we can. So field education, travel. I didn't know I was an amphibian until I went to Africa. And an African saw me and did not see an African, did not hear an African. I wasn't dressed right. I didn't prefer the right food. And I realized that I was not an African in that person's worldview. But when I'm in the United States, as I tried to show with Sherwood Bates, I don't really feel like an American also. So that's when I realized I'm an amphibian. And isn't that what a Christian is supposed to be, an amphibian? Yeah. Yes.
You said something interesting a minute ago about European theology that, let's give some credit where credit's due. Do you see some cooperation, is the right word, but some kind of working together between European theology and Western theology and, say, African, Middle Eastern Asian? Do you see a possibility of all those various diverse theologies working together? And do you see it now, or do you see potential? How do you see that working together?
I think there's a lot of potential. If you get Willie Jennings' book, The Christian Imagination, there is an African mind, taking on the full force of that kind of European theology, but also trying to understand how we have to have that rigorous thinking as well. So he's using this sort of methodology of that kind of westernized theology, but pointing to, he's exercising demons, right? He's making us see with the tool of that rational thinking that can't be the end all. So I think the apophatic tradition, do you all know about that? The apophatic tradition, and that's one of the reasons I want spirituality to be kind of the discourse of what I do. In the early desert fathers and mothers, there was a tradition called the via negativa, or the apophatic tradition, in which the way we know is not simply by naming what we think is, but learning how to remove idols. So that's what I'm trying to say about the European theology is an idol. So we have to be able to say what theology is not, or who God is not. So you have to actually have that tool in mind. And I think that can help us as well to be more ambidextrous in our spirituality or theology. It helps us also not to drink the Kool-Aid for the dysfunctional ways in which we practice being the church with our hearts and our minds. Yes.
You mentioned when you were young, so you had like a choice in your mind of where your life would want to go. Decide that God was like that for you.
Yeah. I think I needed exemplars. Seeing this crazy evangelical spitting preacher talk about justice and poor people. I needed an exemplar. I needed exemplars who were able to provide confluence between that conundrum I had. And I think we all do. We all need to see the possibilities of who we can become, because we all are gifted in unique ways. And left, to just our own devices, we can be discouraged in knowing our true ministry and our true call, unless we have exemplars who can open that box for us. So I think you need exemplars. And I also think you need experience to be out there on the edge, to really know who you are, like my going to Africa or whatever. Trying to be in places and have experiences that can really reveal who you are. Travel is like, you don't know you're an American unless you really leave the United States, and you get those conversations when people are very suspicious of your Americanness, or being in a Black community, being a minority. You don't have that many opportunities really to be a minority as a white person. So those kinds of experiences can really help you to know the call, the unique call that God has for you.
All right. Well, thank you, Michael, and thanks all of you here and online. And we'll be sharing this with everyone. So anyone who didn't get to see it can watch and tune in. We hope you'll join us on Wednesday for chapel and another lunch, and hope you'll stick around for lunch today. But thank you all.